Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. Over the past few days, there's been a lot of attention around an interview given by Susie Wiles, the White House Chief of Staff, to Vanity Fair. Depending on where you look, this interview has been described as blunt, awkward, explosive, or even a glimpse into a divided Trump administration. So instead of reacting emotionally to the headlines, I want to slow this down and do something more useful. I want to walk through three things. In order: first, what actually happened, including what was said and why it raised eyebrows. Second, how different actors reacted afterward. The media, the White House, Trump himself, and Wiles personally. And third, what this episode really tells us about the Trump administration and about American politics more broadly. This isn't about taking sides, it's about understanding systems, incentives, and power. Let's start with the facts, because a lot of interpretation has been layered on top of them. Yes, Susie Wiles did agree to a long, in-depth interview with Vanity Fair. This wasn't a short quote. It wasn't an anonymous background briefing. It was a sustained conversation. And yes, within that interview, she used language that many people felt sounded unusually candid for someone in her position. Some of the comments touched on Donald Trump's personality and governing style, not policies, but temperament, stress, and decision-making habits. Some comments involved other figures in Trump's political orbit, described in ways that felt more realistic than flattering, and some remarks acknowledged internal tension and pressure, the kind that exists in any administration, but is usually kept off the record. None of this amounted to a policy announcement. Nothing about the law changed. No executive order followed. But the tone felt different, and that's why people noticed. Inside any White House, people speak bluntly. They use shorthand. They describe colleagues in unpolished ways. That's normal. What made this interview stand out was that internal language appeared in a public elite-facing magazine, without the usual layers of political smoothing. To many readers, it sounded like something that belonged in a closed-door meeting, not on glossy pages. That disconnect is what created the controversy. So, what happened next? This is the part that often gets rushed, but it matters a lot. The media reaction, the initial media response, followed a familiar pattern. Headlines focused on tension, discomfort, and the idea that Wiles had revealed cracks inside the administration. Stories emphasized phrases that sounded sharp or critical. Less attention was paid to what didn't happen afterward. That's not necessarily bad faith. It's how modern political media works. Conflict travels. Stability doesn't. The White House response was deliberately calm. There was no emergency press conference. No sudden staff shakeup. No attempt to rewrite policy positions. The message, both publicly and through background briefings, was essentially this: Susie Wiles remains Chief of Staff. She retains the President's confidence, and the interview does not reflect any change in how the administration operates. That kind of response is intentional. It's meant to lower the temperature, not escalate it. Trump's reaction was arguably the most telling part of the entire episode. He did not publicly attack Wiles. He did not distance himself from her. He did not frame the interview as betrayal. Instead, he minimized the significance of the controversy itself. For anyone familiar with Trump's first term, that restraint is notable. Early in his presidency, far smaller perceived slights often led to firings or public feuds. This time, he chose not to make it personal. Wiles later pushed back on the framing of the interview. She suggested that her comments were taken out of context, the tone was exaggerating, and the final presentation did not reflect the full conversation, whether you fully accept that explanation or not. The key point is this: she did not resign. She was not forced out. She was not publicly corrected by the president. In Washington terms, that speaks louder than any clarification statement. After all the coverage, all the commentary, and all the speculation, several things very clearly did not happen. There was no personnel purge. There was no internal revolt. There was no policy reversal. There was no visible disruption to the machinery of government. That absence is not accidental. It's analytically meaningful. Here's a counterintuitive but important point. When an administration is genuinely unstable, when it's on the verge of internal collapse, it behaves very differently. Chiefs of staff in failing governments do not give reflective, wide-ranging interviews. Presidents facing real internal rebellion do not respond calmly. Instead, you see panic behavior, abrupt firings, public blame, frantic messaging changes. None of that happened here. What this episode looks like instead is something closer to pressure release. Every political system accumulates internal stress. If that stress has no outlet, it eventually explodes. This didn't look like an explosion. It looked like a system letting off steam. Another reason this interview mattered is because of the dominant narrative around Trump governments. They are often portrayed as emotionally driven, highly personal, lacking internal constraint, but intentionally or not. Wiles' comments suggested something else. They suggested that disagreements exist. Not everyone inside the White House thinks the same way, and those disagreements are managed internally, not acted out publicly. To many institutional actors, donors, markets, national security professionals, that's not alarming, it's reassuring. It suggests process, not chaos. This episode also tells us something important about Trump himself, not psychologically, but politically. If this had happened in 2017 or 2018, the response likely would have been very different. Back then, Trump was more reactive, less tolerant of internal criticism, quicker to remove senior aides. This time, he absorbed it. That suggests he's more comfortable operating as the center of a large, complex system, one that includes people whose job is not to flatter him, but to manage reality. Keeping Wiles in place sends a clear signal. Results matter more than emotional alignment. Whether you like Trump or not, that represents a form of political adaptation. Zooming out, this episode fits into a larger transformation in how American politics works. For decades, political elites emphasized the performance of unity. Disagreements happened, but they stayed hidden. That norm is fading. Now disagreement itself becomes part of the public narrative. Politics feels more transparent, but also more chaotic. This interview sits right at that transition point. It wasn't intended to air internal debate, but once it entered the modern media ecosystem, that's exactly what it became. It's also important to be honest about the media's role here. Vanity Fair wasn't simply recording reality. It was shaping a story for its audience, one that emphasizes personalities, tensions, and power dynamics. That's not corruption. That's incentive. Wiles, like many political professionals, underestimated how internal language would be repackaged once it left a private context. This wasn't about truth versus lies. It was about institutional logic colliding with media logic. At the deepest level, this episode exposes a structural problem that's almost impossible to solve. A modern White House chief of staff is expected to speak brutally honestly behind closed doors, remain disciplined and cautious in public, and maintain working relationships with the press. Those expectations don't naturally fit together. Internal honesty sounds harsh when made public. Public caution sounds artificial when overdone. And media access always carries risk. What happened here wasn't a personal failure. It was the job revealing its built-in tension. So, what will happen next? In practical terms, the fallout is likely limited. In the short term, no restructuring, no leadership changes, probably tighter media access. Over the medium term, fewer deep personality profiles, more controlled messaging, stronger internal boundaries. And in the long term, assuming there are no major procedural failures, this episode will likely be remembered as a side note, not a turning point. So no, this wasn't a moment where the Trump administration was exposed. It was a moment where we caught a glimpse of how American power actually functions today. Imperfect, tense, more open than before, but still very much intact. Power remains concentrated, but it's no longer sealed, and friction between politics and media isn't an exception anymore. It's the normal condition. Whether you support Trump or oppose him, that's the real takeaway.